shoebox. Even a brief glance inside told me it was the repository of whatever past and personal memories Rose Faversham might have wanted to hang on to. Instead of sitting on the bedspread to read by torchlight, I went back downstairs and slipped out of the house like a thief in the night, which I suppose I was, with Rose's shoebox under my arm. A bomb exploded about half a mile away as I sidled down the street. I should have gone to one of the shelters, I know, but I was feeling devil-may-care that night, and I certainly didn't want anyone to know I had broken into Rose's house and stolen her only private possessions. Back in my own humble abode, I made sure my curtains were shut tight, poured a large tumbler of brandy, perhaps apart from nosiness and an inability to suffer fools gladly, my only vice, then turned on the standard lamp beside my armchair and settled down to examine my haul. There was a certain excitement in having pilfered it, as they say, and for a moment I imagined I had an inkling of that illicit thrill Fingers Finnegan must get every time he burgles someone's house. Of course, this was different. I hadn't broken into Rose's house for my own benefit, to line my own pockets, but to solve the mystery of her murder. The first thing the shoebox yielded was a photograph of 3 smiling young women standing in front of an old van with a cross on its side. I could tell by their uniforms that they were nurses from the First World War. On the back, in slightly smudged ink, someone had written, "Midge, Rose and Margaret, Flanders, 30th of July, 1917. Friends inseparable forever." I stared hard at the photograph, and though my imagination may have been playing tricks on me, I thought I recognized Rose as the one in the middle. She had perfect dimples at the edges of her smile, and her eyes gazed pure and clear directly into the lens. She bore little resemblance to the Rose I had known as Mad Maggie, or indeed to the body of Rose Faversham as I had seen it, but I think it was her. I put the photograph aside and pulled out the next item. It was a book of poetry, Seven and Somme by Ivor Gurney. One of my favourite poets, Gurney was gassed at Saint-Julien, near Passchendaele, and sent to a war hospital near Edinburgh. I heard he later became mentally disturbed and suicidal, and he died just 2 or 3 years ago, after nearly 20 years of suffering. I have always regretted that we never met. I opened the book. On the title page, someone had written, "To my darling Rose on her 21st birthday, 20th of March, 1918. Love, Nicholas." So, Rose was even younger than I had thought. I set the book aside for a moment and rubbed my eyes. Sometimes I fancied the residual effects of the gas made them water, though my doctor assured me that it was a foolish notion, as mustard gas wasn't a lacrimator. I hadn't been in the war as late as March 1918. The injury that sent me to a hospital in Manchester, my blighty, took place the year before. Blistered and blinded, I had lain in bed there for months, unwilling to get up. The blindness passed, but the scarring remained, both inside and out. In the small hours when I can't sleep, I relive those early days of August 1917 in Flanders. The driving rain, the mud, the lice, the rats, the deafening explosions. It was madness. We were doomed from the start by incompetent leaders, and as we struggled waist-deep through mud, with shells and bullets flying all around us, we could only watch in hopeless acceptance as our own artillery sank in the mud, and our tanks followed it down. Judging by the words on the back of the photograph, Rose had been there too. Rose, one of the angels of mercy who tended the wounded and the dying in the trenches of Flanders fields. I opened the book. Nicholas, or Rose, had underlined the first few lines of the first poem, "To the Poet Before Battle." Now, youth, the hour of thy dread passion comes. Thy lovely things must all be laid away, and thou, as others, must face the riven day unstirred by rattle of the rolling drums or bugle's strident cry. Perhaps Nicholas had been a poet, and Gurney's call for courage in the face of impending battle applied to him too. And if Nicholas had been a poet, was Rose one of the lovely things he had to set aside? Outside, the all-clear sounded and brought me back to earth. I breathed a sigh of relief. Spared again. Still, I had been so absorbed in Rose's treasures that I probably wouldn't have heard a bomb if one fell next door. They say you never hear the one with your name on. I set the book down beside the photograph and dug around deeper in the shoebox. I found a medal of some sort, I think for valour in wartime nursing, and a number of official papers and certificates. Unfortunately, there were no personal letters. Even so, I managed to compile a list of names to seek out and 1 or 2 official addresses where I might pursue my inquiries into Rose Faversham's past. No time like the present, I thought, going over to my escritoire and taking out pen and paper. I posted my letters early the following morning when I went to fetch my newspaper. I had the day off from school, as the pupils were collecting aluminium pots and pans for the Spitfire Fund, so I thought I might slip into special constable mode and spend an hour or 2 scouring Fingers Finnegan's usual haunts. I started at Frinton's on the High Street, where I also treated myself to 2 rashers of bacon and an egg. By mid-morning, I had made my way around most of the neighbouring cafes, and it was lunchtime when I arrived at Lyons in the city centre. I didn't eat out very often, and twice a day was almost unheard of. Even so, I decided to spend 1 and 3 on roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. There was a lot of meat around then, because the powers that be were slaughtering most of the farm animals to turn the land over to crops. I almost felt that I was doing my national duty by helping eat some before it went rotten. As I waited, I noticed Finnegan slip in through the door in his usual manner, licking his lips, head half bowed, eyes flicking nervously around the room, trying to seek out anyone who might be after him, or to whom he might have owed money. I wasn't in uniform, and I was pretending to be absorbed in my newspaper, so his eyes slid over me. When he decided it was safe, he sat down 3 tables away from me. My meal came, and I tucked in with great enthusiasm, managing to keep Finnegan in my peripheral vision. Shortly, another man came in, dark-haired, red-faced, and sat with Finnegan. The 2 of them put their heads together, all the time Finnegan's eyes flicking here and there, looking for danger signs. I pretended to pay no attention, but was annoyed that I couldn't overhear a word. Something exchanged hands under the table, and the other man left. Finnegan fencing his stolen goods again. I waited, lingering over my tea and rice pudding, and when Finnegan left, I followed him. I hadn't wanted to confront him in the restaurant and cause a scene, so I waited until we came near a ginnel not far from my own street. Then I speeded up, grabbed him by the shoulders and dragged him into it. Finnegan was not very strong. In fact, he was a scrawny, sickly sort of fellow, which is why he wasn't fit for service. But he was slippery as an eel, and it took all my energy to hang on to him until I got him where I wanted him, with his back to the wall and my fists gripping his lapels. I slammed him against the wall a couple of times to take any remaining wind out of his sails. Then, when he went limp, I was ready to start. "Bloody hell, Constable Bascom," he said, when he'd got his breath back. "I didn't recognise you at first. You didn't have to do that, you know. If there's aught you want to know, why don't you just ask me? Let's be civilians about it." "The word is civilised. With you, come off it, Fingers. My name's Michael." "Listen, Michael, I want some answers, and I want them now." "Answers to what?" During last night's air raid, I saw you coming out of a house on Cardigan Road. I never. Don't lie to me. I know it was you. So what? I might have been at my cousin's. He lives on Cardigan Road. You were carrying something. He gave me a couple of kippers. You're lying to me, Fingers, but we'll let that pass for the moment. I'm interested in the raid before that one. When was that, then? Last Wednesday. How do you expect me to remember what I was doing that long ago? Because murder can be quite a memorable experience, Fingers. He turned pale and slithered in my grip. My palms were sweaty. Murder? Me? You've got to be joking. I've never killed nobody. I didn't bother pointing out that that meant he must have killed somebody. Linguistic niceties such as that being as pointless with someone of Finnegan's intelligence as speaking loudly to a foreigner and hoping to be understood. So I pressed on. Did you break into Rose Faversham's house on Aston Place last Wednesday during the raid? Rose Faversham? Who the bloody hell's she when she's at home? Never heard of her. You might have known her as Mad Maggie. Mad Maggie? Now, why would a bloke like me want to break into her house? That's assuming he did things like that in the first place. Hypnotically, like. Hypnotically? Did he mean hypothetically? I didn't even ask. To rob her, perhaps? Nah, you reckon a woman who went around looking like she did would have anything worth stealing? Hypnotically again, of course. Of course, Fingers, this entire conversation is hypnotic. I understand that. Mad Maggie hardly draws attention to herself as a person worth robbing. Not unless you're into antiques. And you're not. Wouldn't know a Chippendale from a Gainsborough. Know anybody who is? Nah. What about the thousands of pounds they say she had hidden in a mattress? And pigs can fly, Constable Bascom. What about silverware? Well, there's a bob or two in a nice canteen of cutlery. Hypnotically, of course. The one thing that might have been of value to someone other than herself was Rose's silverware, and that had been left alone. Even if Fingers had been surprised by her and killed her, he would hardly have left his sole prize behind when he ran off. On the other hand, with a murder charge hanging over it, the silverware might have turned out to be more of a liability than an asset. I looked at his face, into his eyes, trying to decide whether he was telling the truth. You couldn't tell anything from Finnegan's face, though. It was like a ferret mask. Look, he said, licking his lips, I might be able to help you. Help me? Yeah, but, you know, not standing here like this. I realized I was still holding him by the lapels, and I had hoisted him so high he had to stand on his tiptoes. I relaxed my grip. What do you have in mind? We could go to the Prince Albert and have a nice quiet drink. They'll still be open. I thought for a moment. The hard way hadn't got me very far. Maybe a little diplomacy was in order. Though it galled me to be going for a drink with a thieving illiterate like Fingers Finnegan, there were larger things at stake. I swallowed my pride and said, why not? Nobody paid us a second glance, which was all right by me. I bought us both a pint, and we took a quiet table by the empty fireplace. Fingers brought a packet of woodbines out of his pocket and lit up. His smoke burned my lungs and caused me a minor coughing fit, but he didn't seem concerned by it. What makes you think you can help me? I asked him when I'd recovered. I'll bet you're after Mad Maggie's murderer, aren't you? How do you know that? Word gets around. The real police think it was gypsies, you know. They've got one of them in the cells right now. Found some silver candlesticks in his possession. How did they know whether Rose had any silver candlesticks? He curled his lip and looked at me as if I was stupid. They don't, but they don't know that she didn't, do they? All they need's a confession, and he's a brute in the interrogation room, is that short-arse bastard. Who? Longbottom. That's what we call him. Longbottom. Short arse. Get it? I'm falling off my chair with laughter. Have you got anything interesting to tell me, or haven't you? I might have seen someone, mightn't I? Seen someone? Who? Where? He rattled his empty glass on the table. That'd be telling, wouldn't it? I sighed, pushed back the disgust I felt rising like vomit in my craw, and bought him another pint. He was smirking all over his ferret face when I got back. "Ta very much, Constable Bascom. You're a true gentleman, you are." The bugger was enjoying this. "Fingers," I said, "you don't know how much your praise means to me. Now, to get back to what you were saying." "It's Michael, I told you. And none of your Micks or Mikes. My name's Michael." "Right, Michael. You know I'm a patient man, but I'm beginning to feel just a wee bit let down here. I'm thinking that perhaps it might not be a bad idea for me to take you to Detective Sergeant Longbottom and see if he can't persuade you to tell him what you know." Fingers jerked upright. "Hang on a minute. There's no need for anything drastic like that. I'm just having my little bit of fun, that's all. You wouldn't deny a fellow his little bit of fun, would you?" "Heaven forbid," I muttered. "So now you've had your fun, Michael, perhaps we can get back to business." "Right. Well, theatrically speaking, of course, I might have been in Aston Place on the night you're talking about." "Theatrically? Let it go, Frank. Last Wednesday, during the air raid?" "Right. Well, I might have been just, being a concerned citizen and all, going round checking up all the women and kids was in the shelters like. And the old people. Don't forget the old people. Oh, especially the old people. Anyway, like I said, I just might have been passing down Aston Place during the air raid, seeing that everyone was all right, and I might just have seen someone coming out of Mad Maggie's house." "Did you?" "Well, it was dark, and that bloody smoke from the power station doesn't make things any better. Like a real pea souper, that is. Anyway, I might just have seen this figure, like a quick glimpse." "I understand. Any idea who it was?" "Not at first I hadn't, but now I've an idea. I just hadn't seen him for a long time." "Where were you?" "Coming out of... It can't have been more than 2 or 3 houses away. When I saw him, he gave me a real fright, so I pressed myself back in the doorway, so he couldn't see me." "But you got a look at him?" "Not a good one. First thing I noticed, though, is he was wearing a uniform." "What kind of uniform?" "I don't know, do I? Soldiers, I suppose." "Anything else?" "Well, he moved off sort of sideways like." "Crabwise?" "Come again?" "Like a crab." "If you say so, Constable Bascom." Something about all this was beginning to make sense, but I wasn't sure I liked the sense it made. "Did you notice anything else?" "I saw him go into a house across the street." "Which one?" I asked, half of me not wanting to know the answer. "The milkman's," he said. I didn't want to, but I had to see this through. Tommy Fletcher. My own godson. All afternoon I thought about it, and I could see no way out of confronting Harry and Tommy. No matter how much thinking I did, I couldn't come up with an explanation. And if Tommy had murdered Rose Faversham, I wanted to know why. He had certainly been acting oddly since he came back from the army hospital, but I had acted rather strangely myself after they released me from the hospital in Manchester in 1918. I knew better than to judge a man by the way he reacts to war. I consoled myself with the fact that Tommy might not have killed Rose, that she was already dead when he went to see her, but I knew in my heart that didn't make sense. Nobody just dropped in on Mad Maggie to see how she was doing, and the idea of 2 people going to see her in one night was absurd. No, I knew that the person Fingers had seen coming out of Rose's house had to be her killer, and he swore that person was Tommy Fletcher. Fingers could have been lying, but that didn't make sense either. For a start, he wasn't that clever. He must also know that I would confront Tommy and that one way or another I'd find out the truth. No, if Fingers had killed Mad Maggie and wanted to escape blame, all he had to do was deny that he'd been anywhere near her house and let the gypsy take the fall. I steeled myself with a quick brandy. Then I went around to Harry's house just after 8 o'clock. They were all listening to a variety programme on the home service, and someone was torturing and nightingales sang in Berkeley Square. As usual, Tommy was wearing his army uniform, even though he was on extended leave. He still looked ill, pale and thin. His mother, Polly, a stout, silent woman I had known ever since she was a little girl, offered to make tea and disappeared into the kitchen.
"What brings you out at this time of night, then?"
Harry asked.
"Want some company down at the Prince Albert?"
I shook my head. "Actually, it's your Tommy I came to see." A shadow of fear crossed Harry's face.
"Tommy? Well, you'd better ask him yourself, then. Best of luck."
Tommy hadn't moved yet, but when I addressed him, he slowly turned to face me. There was a look of great disappointment in his eyes, as if he knew he had had something valuable in his grasp, only to have it taken from him at the last minute. Harry turned off the radio. "Tommy," I said, speaking as gently as I could, "did you go to visit Mad Maggie last Wednesday night, the night of the air raid?" Harry was staring at me, disbelief written all over his face.
"For God's sake, Frank,"
he began, but I waved him down. "Did you, Tommy? Did you visit Mad Maggie?" Slowly, Tommy nodded.
"You don't have to say any more,"
Harry said, getting to his feet. He turned to me as if I were his betrayer.
"I've considered you a good friend for many years, Frank, but you're pushing me too far."
Polly came back with the teapot and took in the scene at a glance.
"What's up? What's going on?"
"Sit down, Polly," I said. "I'm asking your Tommy a few questions, that's all." Polly sat. Harry remained standing, fists clenched at his sides. Then Tommy's voice broke the deadlock.
"It's all right, Mum," he said to Polly. "I want to tell him. I want to get it off my chest."
"I don't know what you're talking about, son," she said. Tommy pointed at Harry.
"He does. He's not as daft as he looks."
I looked at Harry, who sat down again and shook his head. Tommy turned back to me.
"Did I go visit Mad Maggie?" "Yes, I did." "Did I kill her?" "Yes, I did. I got in through the back window. It wasn't locked. I picked up the posser and went through into the living room. She was sitting in the dark. Didn't even have a wireless. She must have heard me, but she didn't move. She looked at me just once before I hit her, and I could swear she knew why I was doing it. She understood, and she knew it was right. It was just." As Tommy spoke, he became more animated and his eyes started to glow with life again, as if his prize were once more within his grasp. "Why did you do it, Tommy?" I asked. "What did she ever do to harm you?" He looked at Harry. "She killed my dad."
"She what?"
"I told you. She killed me dad. Me real dad."
Polly flopped back in her armchair, tea forgotten, and put her hand to her heart. "Tommy, what are you saying?"
"He knew,"
he said, looking at Harry again.
"Or at least he suspected. I told him about the field, about the villagers, the mad woman."
Harry shook his head.
"I didn't know," he said. "You never told me it was her. All I knew was that you were upset, you were saying crazy things and acting strange, especially when you came in from the raid that night. I was worried, that's all. If I ever suspected you, that's the only reason, son, I swear it. When I found her body, I thought if there were the remotest possibility. That's why I went for Frank. I told him to lay off it, to let the Jippos take the blame, but he wouldn't."
Harry pointed his finger at me, red in the face.
"If you want to blame anyone, blame him."
"Calm down, Harry," I told him. "You'll give yourself a heart attack."
"It's not a matter of blame," Tommy said. "It's about justice, and justice has been served."
"Better tell me about it, Tommy," I said. The air raid siren went off, wailing up and down the scale. We all ignored it. Tommy paused and ran his hand through his closely cropped hair. He looked at me.
"You should understand, Mr. Bascom. You were there. He was your best friend.
I frowned. Tell me, Tommy.
Before Dunkirk, a group of us got cut off, and we were in this village near Ypres for a few days before the Germans got too close. We almost didn't make it to the coast in time for the evacuation. The people were frightened about what the Germans might do if they found out we were there, but they were kind to us. I became quite friendly with one old fella who spoke very good English, and I told him that my father had been killed somewhere near here in the First War. Passchendaele. I said I'd never seen his grave. One day, the old man took me out in his horse and cart and showed me some fields. It was late May, and the early poppies were just coming out among the rows of crosses. It looked beautiful. I knew my father was there somewhere.
Tommy choked for a moment, looked away and wiped his eyes.
Then the old man told me a story, he went on. He said there was a woman living in the village who used to, you know, with the British soldiers. But she was in love with a German officer, and she passed on any information she could pick up from the British directly to him. One soldier let something slip about some new trench positions they were preparing for a surprise attack, and before anyone knew what had hit them, the trenches were shelled, and the Germans swarmed into them. They killed every British soldier in their path. It came to hand-to-hand combat in the end, bayonets, and the woman's German lover was one of the last to die.
Tommy paused, glanced at his mother, and went on.
He told me she never recovered. She went mad, and for a while after the armies had moved on, she could be heard wailing for a dead German lover in the poppy fields at night. Then nothing more was heard of her. The rumour was that she'd gone to England, where they had plenty of other mad women to keep her company. I thought of Mad Maggie right from the start, of course, and I remembered the way she used to burst into French every now and then. I asked him if he had a photograph, and he said he thought he had an old one. We went back to his house, and he rummaged through his attic and came down with an old album. There she was. The same sort of clothes, that same look about her, much younger and very beautiful. But it was her. It was Mad Maggie. And she'd killed my father. He was in one of those trenches.
What happened next, Tommy?
I don't remember much of the next couple of months. The Germans got too close and we had to make a hasty departure. That's when I was wounded. I was lucky to make it to Dunkirk. If it hadn't been for my mates, they carried me most of the way. Anyway, for a while I didn't know where I was. In and out of consciousness. To be honest, half the time I preferred to be out of it. I had dreams, nightmares, visions, and I saw myself coming back and avenging my father's death.
His eyes shone with pride and righteousness as he spoke. Outside, the bombs were starting to sound alarmingly close.
"Let's get down to the shelter," Harry suggested. "No," said Tommy, holding up his hand. "Hear me out now. Wait till I'm done." He turned to me. "You should understand, Mr. Bascom. She killed my dad. He was your best friend. You should understand. I only did what was right."
I shook my head. There's no avenging deaths during wartime, Tommy. It's every man for himself. Some German bullet or bayonet had Larry's name on it, and that was that. Wrong place, wrong time. It could just as easily have been me. Tommy stared at me in disbelief. "Besides," I went on, getting a little concerned at the explosions outside, "are you sure it was her, Tommy? It seems an awful coincidence that she should end up living on our street, don't you think?"
"I'm sure. I saw the photograph. I've still got it."
"Can I have a look?" Tommy opened his top pocket and handed me a creased photograph. There was no doubt about the superficial resemblance between the woman depicted there, leaning against a farmer's fence, wearing high-buttoned boots, smiling and holding her hands to her forehead to keep the sun out of her eyes. But it wasn't the same woman whose photograph I had found in Rose Faversham's shoebox. In fact, it wasn't any of the three, Midge, Rose, or Margaret. There were no dimples for a start, and the eyes were different. We all have our ways of identifying people, and with me, It's always the eyes. Show me someone at 6, 16 and 60, and I'll know if it's the same person or not, by the eyes. Another bomb landed far too close for comfort, and the whole house shook. Then a split second later came a tremendous explosion. Plaster fell off the ceiling. The lights and radio went off. I could hear the drone of the bombers slowly disappearing to the southeast on their way home again. We were all shaken, but I pulled myself to my feet first and suggested we go outside to see if anyone needed help. I didn't really think he'd make a run for it, but I stuck close to Tommy as we all went outside. The smell was awful. The bitter, fiery smell of the explosive and a whiff of gas from a fractured pipe mixed with the dust from broken masonry. The sky was lit up like Guy Fawkes night. It was a terrible sight that met our eyes, and the four of us could only stand and stare. A bomb had taken out about 3 houses on the other side of the street. The middle one, now nothing but a pile of burning rubble, was Mad Maggie's. When the answers to my letters started trickling in a couple of weeks after Tommy's arrest, I picked up some more leads, one of which eventually led me to Midge Livesey, now a mother of 2 boys, both in the RAF, who was living only 30 miles away in the country. I telephoned her, and she seemed pleased to hear from someone who had known Rose, though she was saddened by the news of Rose's death, and she suggested I be her guest for the weekend. Though it was late October, the weather was fine when I got off the train at the tiny station. It was a wonderful feeling to be out in the country again. I had been away for so long, I had almost forgotten what the autumn leaves looked like, and how many different varieties of birdsong there are. The sweet, acrid scent of burning leaves from someone's garden made a fine change from the stink of the air raids. Midge and her husband Arthur welcomed me at the door of their cottage and told me they had already prepared the spare room. After I had laid out my things on the bed, I opened the window. Directly outside stood an apple tree, and beyond that I could see the landscape undulating to the north, where the large anvil shapes of peaks and fells were visible in the distance. I took in a deep breath of fresh air, as deep as I could manage with my poor lungs, and for once it didn't make me cough. Perhaps it was time I left the city, I thought. But no, there were police duties to attend to, and I loved my teaching job. After the war, perhaps, I would think about it again and see if I could get a job in a village school. When I showed Midge the photograph of the 3 of them over dinner that evening, a sad smile played across her features, and she touched the surface with her fingers, as if it could send out some sort of message to her. "Yes," she said, "that was Rose. And that was Margaret. Poor Margaret. She died in childbirth 10 years ago. The war wasn't all bad for us. We did have some good times. But I think the day that photograph was taken marked the beginning of the end. It was the day before the 3rd Ypres battle started, and we were field nurses. We used to go onto the fields and into the trenches to clean up after the battles." She shook her head and looked at Arthur, who tenderly put his hand on top of hers. "You've never... Well, I suppose you have." She looked at her husband. "Arthur understands, too. He was wounded at Arras. I worry about my boys. Just remembering, just thinking about it, makes me fear for them terribly. Does that make sense?" "Yes," I said. She paused for a moment and poured us all tea. "Anyway, Rose was especially sensitive," she went on. "She wrote poetry and wanted to go to university to study English literature when it was all over. French, too. She spoke French very well and spent a lot of time talking to the poor wounded French soldiers. Often they were with the English, you know, and there was nobody could talk to them. Rose did. She fell in love with a handsome young English lieutenant. Nicholas, his name was." She smiled. "But we were young. We were always falling in love back then." "What happened to her?" I asked. "Rose? She broke under the strain. Shell shock, I suppose you'd call it. You hear a lot about the poor boys, the breakdowns, the self-inflicted wounds, but you never hear much about the women, do you? Where are we in the history books? We might not have been shooting at the Germans and only in minimal danger of getting shot at ourselves, though there were times. But we were there. We saw the slaughter firsthand. We were up to our elbows in blood and guts. Some people just couldn't take it, the way some of the boys couldn't take combat. I'll say this, though. I think it was Nicholas's death that finally sent Rose over the edge. It was the following year, 1918, the end of March, near a little village on the Somme called Saint-Quentin. She found him, you know, on the field. It was pure chance. Half his head had been blown away. She was never the same. She used to mutter to herself in French and go into long silences. Eventually she tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose of morphine, but a doctor found her in time. She was invalided out in the end. Do you know what happened next? I visited her as soon as the war was over. She'd just come out of the hospital and was living with her parents. They were wealthy landowners, very posh, you might say, and they hadn't a clue what to do with her. She was an embarrassment to them. In the end, they set up a small fund for her so she would never have to go without, and left her to her own devices. After a moment or two's silence, I showed Midge the book of poetry. Again, she fingered it like a blind person looking for meaning. Oh, yes. Ivor Gurney. She was always reading this. She turned the pages. This was her favourite. She read us a short poem called Bach and the Sentry, in which the poet on sentry duty hears his favourite Bach prelude in his imagination and wonders how he will feel later when he actually plays the piece again, in peacetime. Then she shook her head. Poor Mad Rose. Nobody knew what to do with her. Do tell me what became of her. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much, though for some reason I held back the part about Tommy and his mistake. I didn't want Midge to know that my godson had mistaken her friend for a traitor. It seemed enough to lay the blame at the feet of a gypsy thief and hope that Midge wasn't one of those women who followed criminal trials closely in the newspapers. Nor did I tell her that Rose's house had been destroyed by a bomb almost a week after the murder, and that she would almost certainly have been killed anyway. Midge didn't need that kind of cruel irony. She had suffered enough. She had enough bad memories to fuel her nightmares, and enough to worry about in the shape of her two boys. I simply told her that Rose was a very private person, certainly eccentric in her dress and her mannerisms, and that none of us really knew her very well. She was a part of the community, though, and we all mourned her loss. So, Mad Maggie was another of war's victims, I thought, as I breathed in the scent of the apple tree before getting into bed that night. One of the uncelebrated ones. She came to our community to live out her days in anonymous grief and whatever inner peace she could scrounge for herself, her sole valuable possessions, a book of poetry, an old photograph, and a nursing medal. And so she would have remained, a figure to be mocked by the children and ignored by the adults, had it not been for another damn war, another damaged soul, and the same poppy field in Flanders. Requiescat in pace, Rose, though I am not a religious man. Requiescat in pace. It should never have happened, but they hanged Tommy Fletcher for the murder of Rose Faversham at Wandsworth Prison on the 25th of May, 1941, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Everyone said Tommy should have got off for psychiatric reasons, but his barrister had a permanent hangover and the judge had an irritable bowel. In addition, the expert psychiatrist hired to evaluate him didn't know shell shock from an Oedipus complex. The only thing we could console ourselves with was that Tommy went to the gallows proud, and at peace with himself for having avenged his father's death. I hadn't the heart to tell him that he was wrong about Mad Maggie, that she wasn't the woman he thought she was.